Our next panelist is Amy Slonaker, whose presentation is called The Gospel According to Jughead, Monster Theory and Comparative Popular Culture Practices as Hermeneutic Lenses. Amy is a cat fancier from Goleta, California. She graduated from UC Santa Barbara with a double major in religious studies and political science. During her 20-plus year law career, she lived in Seattle, San Francisco, New York City, and London. In 2017, she enrolled at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where she is currently pursuing her PhD in mythological studies with an emphasis in depth psychology, with an expected completion date of 2020. I like the sound of that, Amy. A lover of popular culture, Amy has dabbled in an array of art media, including installation art, costume and set design, public performance art, and psychedelic liquid light shows. Her favorite musical is Oklahoma. And with that, Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, does that look, it's not quite up yet, is it?
Not quite, it's still thinking. There it is. It's
fantastic.
Full screen.
Sorry for this pop up. Sometimes these plague me. Okay, so thank you, Mythologium, for having me, and hello to everybody watching. This presentation grew out of my PhD coursework in the Mythological Studies Department at Pacifica Graduate Institute, where I initially wrote down these ideas in the form of a term paper for a class called Methods and Contemporary Issues in Religious Studies, taught by David Odorisio in the winter of 2019. For that paper, we were asked to choose one of the hermeneutic lenses from our textbook and apply it critically to a topic in order to assess the method's effectiveness. That had the possibility of being a pretty dry exercise, but luckily our main textbook for the course was Comparing Religion, written by Jeffrey Kripal. Originally published in 2014, the textbook is an unconventional overview of the variety of ways religion scholars compare the different traditions. I call it unconventional because, for instance, it unflinchingly discusses topics like UFO contact or supernatural assault traditions, as Kripal calls them, as just another text to be hermeneutically assessed. In that vein, Comparing Religion opens the religious studies discussion to more avant-garde hermeneutical techniques such as monster studies, which Kripal categorizes as a tool for the comparative practices of popular culture. So for my paper, I chose to use monster studies ideas as the basis for a comparison of pop culture texts. So before I launch into my short comments, I'll provide a mini roadmap for what I'm going to discuss. First, I'll show some images from my pop culture text, which I used to facilitate my analysis. And then I'll explain and apply 2 ideas from monster studies that help me analyze these texts. And finally, I will conclude, not to spoil it, that monster studies is a new tool in my hermeneutical toolkit that help expand my analytical capacity to make fresh analogies in new and monstrous areas. So to start my hermeneutic exercises in monster studies, I needed some text to practice hermeneutics on. And just as this paper was coming due, I had been noticing a potentially percolating trend in pop culture that I was curious about. Namely, the darkening of traditionally sweet Americana brands, Archie Comics and Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma. Traditionally, the entertainment franchises of Archie and Oklahoma present themselves as American as apple pie through their depiction of characters and attitudes that support the social norms and gender roles of our existing social order. But in their current incarnations, the wholesome diner is a place for sullen teens to glower at pie slices, and Oklahoma's protagonists, Lori and Curly, are portrayed as besmirched in the blood of a man they bullied to death. The dark retelling of the Archie comic universe premiered on the CW television network in 2017 before finding its current home on Netflix, where fans await the forthcoming 5th season. Called Riverdale, after the idyllic town where Archie and his friends grew up, its current incarnation presents a town soured by murder and other unwholesomeness. This dark turn is notable in the portrayal of the Jughead character. Traditionally depicted by his comic creators as an affable and lovable oddball, the Jughead character of Riverdale barely contains the emotional tempest within himself as stoked by his abusive and alcoholic father. Riverdale's Jughead chooses to secretly sleep under the stairs at school to avoid the squalor at home. When Archie discovers this, Jughead comes to live with him and soon is even dating Betty, the perfect girl next door. In contrast to Riverdale's Jughead, who is romantically successful, the traditional comic Jughead is depicted as a rolling stone in Archie comics, eschewing the active dating life of his peers for plates of cheeseburgers and fries. Another important change in the Riverdale television retelling is that it chooses Jughead as its narrator of events. The social outcast Jughead intones over each show's opening credits and often provides his moralizing summation at the end of an episode. As narrator and in a withering tone, Jughead unsentimentally cuts through the social veneer to describe Riverdale's now rotten core. Jughead, as an outsider narrator, has nothing to lose by laying Riverdale's secrets bare. The second popular culture text I used in my comparison was the markedly dark 2019 stage production of Rodgers and Hammerstein's Oklahoma, staged on Broadway's Circle in the Square Theater, premiering in March 2019. This production's minimal staging and lighting set a stark stage for the portrayal of the Oklahoma narrative, which, without changing the traditional dialogue, presents a story that the audience perceives as an indictment of the normally heroic Curly and his new wife, Lori, who, by their social rejection of a wounded outsider named Judd Fry, precipitate his murder. In Oklahoma, the murder of the outsider is accepted by the townspeople, who tacitly support Curly's disposing of the monstrous element lurking in their community. Despite shooting Judd Fry point blank, Curly goes unpunished for his deeds, free to fulfill his dreams of marrying the cream of the town's crop. The 1955 film version of Oklahoma presents the traditional portrayal of the Curly-Judd conflict as an almost comedic affair. For example, in the musical number between Curly and Judd, called Poor Judd is Dead, the audience is given a chuckle as Curly needles Judd to suicide, singing to him mawkishly. While this movie scene is played comically, the Broadway version by director Daniel Fish, the staging of the same song, features almost total blackness on the stage and refuses to be read as anything but a threatening moment where Curly manipulates Judd toward the grave like a cyberbullying teenager. Fish's production forces the audience to watch the good guy mercilessly tear down the hapless Judd. Thus, no one in the audience is left genuinely innocent to ask, how could this happen, by the time of Judd's attempt at violent retribution in the final act. This stained innocence is mirrored in the all-cast finale, where virgin white costumes and the stage itself are drenched in Judd Fry's vibrant blood. A life needlessly taken by Fish's tarnished hero, Curly. So those are the two texts I chose to examine in what Kripal, the textbook author, calls comparative practices of popular culture. So I said, that's great. I've compared the current text to the older versions. It seems clear they were kind of light and now they're turning dark. What might this mean from this comparison? And I thought, well, maybe this new darkness can be viewed in Jungian terms. Maybe the contemporary landscape in America is so dark, so out of whack politically, race relationally, that America has no choice but to examine its shadow at this time. And maybe the darkening of our beloved Americana characters is a way that we can tolerate examining the collective shadow of our American culture, whose destructiveness supports only a veneer of good living. But that's more Jungian. I was here to do monster studies. So I felt it was a little too general for what I was trying to accomplish. So I read further about monster studies in the writing of Linda C. Ceriello, whose essay called Metamodern Monsters as Transformational Figures of Instability introduced me to the idea of the metamodern monster as an important figure within monster studies. I decided I could apply monster studies to my text if I chose to read Judd and Jughead as metamodern monsters based on their status as social sexual outsiders, which I'll explain. In her essay, Sariello describes meta-modern monsters as figures more likely to be embraced by the culture that produced them. In distinction, the modern monster, exemplified by Dr. Frankenstein's creation, faces only rejection, first from his own maker, and second from society at large that runs the monster out of town on a rail, because they fear the beast as a threatening figure of anomaly within the well-established order of things. This modern monster was nothing but bad news to be expelled ASAP. According to Sariello, in contrast to modern monsters, the meta-modern monster's challenge to the natural order of things may possess a transformative capacity for its audience. The monstrous is increasingly felt as a familiar sensibility, even the basis for an ethos of pluralism and a new kind of effective safety zone, not erasing difference, but making room for the monstrous in all. Making room for the monstrous seems an apt way to describe both the newly dark versions of Jughead and Judd. In the case of Judd Fry on Broadway, it is his wounded pathos that drives the current production's whole tone, as widely noted by theater critics in the New York Times and elsewhere. Fish's production humanizes the monster enough that we're able to feel pity for Judd and are thus conflicted by his killing in what is normally presented as a happy ending. Likewise, in Riverdale, Jughead is now driving the narrative. His outsider viewpoint is now the privileged perspective on the whole story. Jughead is also clearly embraced socially on the Riverdale show, hanging with the popular crowd, sensitively coddled by his new cheerleader girlfriend who poignantly empathizes with Jughead's emotional strife. So it seems like Judd and Jughead are probably meta-modern monsters, as Sariello describes, and as such, they contribute in these current darker versions of traditional narratives. I still wondered about why it was happening now, though, and why we're more willing to have monsters telling our tales. And I dug a little deeper into the creative history of Riverdale, and I found an elucidating backstory. In April 2003, at a small regional theater in Atlanta, a recent Yale School of Drama grad and lifelong Archie Comics fan prepared for opening night of his stage production, a tribute to Archie Comics called Archie's Weird Fantasy. The Yale grad named Roberto Aguirre Sacasa wrote and directed this production, which featured an adult gay Archie living in New York City. Unfortunately, the play's premiere never happened once discussions with Archie Comics derailed over the issue of homosexuality. The old guard, family owners of Archie Comics, believed that any gay affiliation would irrevocably tarnish the Archie image. And so the theater was served a cease and desist order, barring them from presenting Aguirre Sacasa's version of Archie to the public or risk millions of dollars in fines. From this threatened legal action in 2003, we see how serious the creators of Archie were in their desire to maintain a squeaky clean image in the face of changing times. But time does march on, and 6 years later, the original Archie creators and owners were dead, and their heirs stood ready to update and overhaul the Archie brand in a direction their founders refused to tread. By March of 2009, they were searching for a new chief creative officer, someone to take their brand in a fresh and edgy direction. But who? In a major turnaround for Archie Comics, they offered the position of CCO to none other than Roberto Aguirre Sacasa, that same Yale grad that they threatened to sue into oblivion for tarnishing the Archie brand. Within a short time at Archie, Aguirre Sacasa expanded his role to include showrunner of the Riverdale television series, now in its 4th season. Aguirre Sacasa's rise from lawsuit defendant to CCO provides an interesting real-life example of how an outsider viewed as monstrous has now been accepted into the fold. The similarity between Aguirre Sacasa, now creatively helming Archie Comics, and Jughead, the former outcast, now inhabiting the role of narrator on Riverdale, seems like an interesting parallel that may consciously be part of Aguirre's creative message. It also reminds me of Jeffrey Kripal's suggestion that not everything imagined is imaginary, in which case perhaps the darker tones we see cast over our traditional tales reflect the experiences of the new outsiders writing them. So Aguirre Sacasa recently retweeted a photo from his famously banned play, which he later staged after changing the characters' names. Aguirre Sacasa notes in his tweet that without the Dad's Garage incident, Riverdale would never have happened. So I had one more monster studies idea to apply to my text, anti-diachronicity. Let me just check my time here. Okay. Which is considered a key component of monster study methods, according to Jeffrey Cohen, whose seminal statement on monster studies appears in his edited volume called Monster Theory, Reading Culture from 1996. In the intro to this volume, Cohen describes anti-diachronicity as a central concern of monster theory. He gives the example of Ruth Waterhouse as a scholar using anti-diachronic approaches, describing Waterhouse's scholarship as following the insights of the deconstructionists and theorists of intertextuality. Waterhouse argues that we should make a problem of temporality rather than simply reinscribing it, and that our intertextual studies need not require linear and chronological relationships in order to be meaningful. Indeed, Waterhouse's brand of intertextuality assumes relationships between one text and others, but does not presuppose that those relationships are only linear and chronological. So Waterhouse's study of Grendel, for example, is filtered through such intervening texts as Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. In this way, Waterhouse suggests that ancient texts can reach through time to provide contemporary insight. She says, the poem of Beowulf is able to reflect back a decoder's own society and culture, as well as hint at aspects of its contemporary cultural social attitudes. And that, if for a researcher, a more recent text is a starting point for the exploration of older text, that intertextuality is as relevant as any other. So I found this monster studies idea freeing. It broadened my thinking about which texts I could use in my comparison to try to find meaning about 21st century pop culture trends. I started to imagine all the different tales over time that have been told from an outsider perspective, and I thought of a book I had recently been reading by Elaine Pagels about the Gospel of Judas, a first century Gnostic Christian text attributed to the ultimate pariah, Judas Iscariot, the disciple who betrayed Jesus. Was there any insight to be gleaned about my contemporary texts by comparing them to outsiders from the first century AD? I gave it a shot. In her book, The Gospel of Judas, Pagel explains how first century Gnostic Christian texts were attributed to a variety of authors who claimed to have firsthand knowledge of Christ's teachings. The Gospel of Judas was one such example, as was the Gospel of Mary, attributed to Mary Magdalene. According to Pagels, each Gnostic narrator presented a particular philosophic issue that helped early Christians more deeply understand the nature of their new religion. For instance, in the Gospel of Mary, the issue of female leadership in the church is debated. Mary's version of the gospel, Pagel says, shows us what issues divided believers during those formative years, and that her dispute with Peter in the Gospel of Mary suggests that one question proved explosively controversial. Can a woman be a leader among disciples, or can she even be a disciple at all? In a similar way, the Gospel of Judas raises the question, how can God's plan for his all-knowing son how can God's plan allow for his all-knowing son to be bamboozled and betrayed by one of his inner circle? To answer this question, the New Testament Gospel of Luke and the New Testament Gospel of John suggest that Judas' motive was greed, or maybe that he was possessed by the devil. But when Judas narrates his own story in the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, we learn that Judas enjoyed a special relationship to Jesus. For example, when Jesus said to Judas, "Separate from the other disciples, I will tell you the mysteries of the kingdom. You will surpass them all, for you will sacrifice the human being who bears me. Behold, everything has been told you." The version of the Jesus story, as told in the Gospel of Judas, allows us to have sympathy for Judas, the betrayer, since he had no choice in his actions. He was tasked by Jesus himself with a pivotal role in Christ's mission on earth. So I thought, let me anti-diachronically compare Jughead to Judas, since they are both outsider narrators, although not linked chronologically, really, or linearly in any obvious way. But according to Waterhouse, ancient texts can effectively reflect back my own society. And thus, insights come by challenging ideas of linear time. So I considered that if Pagels is right on these outsider Gnostic narratives, and they are shining light on a particular issue in their community, then what light is Jughead's perspective attempting to point out? if Jughead had a gospel, what would be its message? And when I thought about Jughead and Judd together, I saw them as shunned and bullied outsiders, just the type of loner that becomes a school shooter or the self-professed incels who commit mass shootings. Cut off from social access and filled with rage, perhaps Jughead and Judd represent these figures of our social concerns, raising real-world issues through their dark portrayals. So by imagining the Riverdale and the dark Oklahoma production as Gnostic Gospels, I was able to think about these texts' narrators in new ways that gave me new ideas about their motivation and why they might be surfacing in pop culture right now. In conclusion, I found that thinking through a monster lens was a useful exercise that expanded my realm of analogy making and prompted me to think in fresh directions. It's a tool I plan to keep in my scholar's toolbox. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy, and a big round of applause for everybody. That was wonderful. We are almost at time, but if it's okay with the panelists and the attendees, I'd like to go just a few minutes past 3 o'clock, just so we can hear your voices just a little bit more in a little bit of discussion. So this was a fascinating panel, and we moved so far in it. We began with Dante and Thor, we went to Maggie and Star Trek Anima Animus, and then Amy and Monster Theory and Jughead and Oklahoma. And yet, all these different things, I do feel a thread. I feel a thread connecting them. You know, and maybe that thread has to do with the dichotomies that all three presentations lifted. You know, in Thor, we saw God and human, we saw ancient and future. In Star Trek, obviously, Anima Animus, and, you know, original Trek, new Trek. And in Amy, you know, there's the monster goody goody almost dichotomy. You know, I'm struggling to find the right word for that. Like, not monster. Like, monster has almost, you know, sort of kind of taken over my thinking about it. Like, what do you call the original Jughead after seeing the monster Jughead, right?
Squeaky clean. I don't know.
Squeaky clean, right? Goody goody, squeaky clean. These, like, you know, we have to like put together words to come up with something. So thinking, I guess, in terms of those dichotomies and imagining into them the way all three of your presentations did so beautifully, I wonder if each of you would just comment a little bit on how you're holding that idea. Did the other presentations change your thinking at all? Did they make you think in different ways? All three presentations definitely changed my thinking. And so I think I'd like to go in the order that we went. We'll begin with Dante, then we'll go to Maggie, and then we'll go to Amy. Dante, any thoughts? The dichotomy? Yeah, go ahead.
Of course. So that's an interesting questions, and I believe that there are some ideas that I found it from you guys' presentation and the previous presentation, is that we need to have when we talk about myth, there is an interaction between the story with the people that are telling the story, because I believe that there should be an interactive so that we can bring out the new sense of ideas. For example, the Star Trek, I read about how Star Trek came to be. It's actually from some type of local stories about the UFO sightings, and the writers, they create the Star Trek from that. As long as we have the interaction with the audience, we interact with the local audience, we bring new sense of culture, new sense of symbols to the piece of art of mythology and even in media.
Interesting. So bringing the local audience in. Interesting. Maggie, do you have any?
I think it's what Amy was saying on how, you know, our society is reflected on the old myth. Of course, now I'm thinking about Wimpy and Popeye. It's like, is he going to be next? But yeah, I mean, in Star Trek, actually, it's more now. We have Picard. Now we've got Picard. Now we've got postmodern, mad, pissed off Picard, who's not even human anymore. You know, I mean, how far can you get from from the thing? But yeah, I think it goes, the thread, even through Dante was talking about, is it Ramacorp? the word, the modern
Ragnarok.
day. Yes. How that's
Ragnarok.
yes, how that's the modern day equivalent of Thor, and bringing Oklahoma to the 20th century, and yeah, I mean that was like an iffy scene in the musical to begin with. I mean, what were they thinking? But Rogers and Hammerstein are also South Pacific with you have to be carefully taught, and they did a lot of other stuff too. But yeah, I think Amy's absolutely correct that was it Waterhouse? Is that the
Yeah.
person quoting? Yeah, that's definitely the connecting tissue.
Yeah, her ideas like really freed up my ability to kind of have fun with it, and it really did. I wouldn't have thought in that direction if I hadn't done it. I kind of thought it sounded a little odd, but I kind of came up with this idea, and I'm like, hey, that's kind of an interesting, new, fresh perspective.
Can you give me her full name in the book again? Because yeah.
Hold on, I'm gonna say it wrong because I'm like nervous.
Because that was really fascinating.
Yeah, Ruth Waterhouse. It's all in it. It appears in that Jeffrey Cohen volume, which really is. He has these like 7 breakable postulates of monster theory. His is really the seminal statement. Jeffrey Cohen's monster theory includes Ruth Waterhouse's piece, which I'm flailing to.
Well, Amy, it'd be great if you could put those sources in the chat so we all have them.
I will.
That would be fabulous.
Thank you. And overall, I was excited to see a comparative popular culture here on my panel with the Star Trek, looking at old. That was cool.
Very fun. Awesome panel, all 3 of you. So yeah.